They didn't take them with chains. They took them with promises. Promises of a better life, of education, of a future. But what they gave instead was silence, fear, and shame. All across Africa, from Nigeria to Kenya, Ghana to Uganda, Senegal to the Congo, colonial authorities and missionaries built schools not to educate African children, but to unmake them. Children as young as 6 were taken from their villages, some lured by false hope, others ripped from their families by force. They were loaded onto wagons or marched for miles to schools they had never heard of. Their parents were told they'd become civilized, Christian, useful. But when the doors of those schools shut behind them, everything familiar was stripped away. Their names were replaced with English or French ones. Their languages were banned. Speaking them meant beatings or isolation. Their hair was cut, their clothes burned, their beliefs ridiculed. They were told that their families, their ancestors, their gods were wrong, that their culture was primitive, that their way of life was backward. They were told day after day that they were not enough, not unless they became someone else. And some never came home. Disease, abuse, malnutrition, and despair claimed many lives behind those walls. And those who did return came back strangers, to their people and to themselves. They spoke foreign tongues. They no longer knew the stories of their elders. Some couldn't even remember their own names. This isn't ancient history. This was happening as recently as the 1960s and 70s in parts of Africa. But the world doesn't talk about it. Because colonial education is still remembered as a gift. Because these were schools, not prisons. Because what they destroyed wasn't visible, but to the families who lost their children, in body or in spirit, the pain has never gone away. In this episode, we uncover the silenced truth behind Africa's colonial boarding schools, the system that promised knowledge but delivered cultural death, and why telling this story now might be the first step in healing the wound that never closed. What were colonial boarding schools in Africa? To understand how deeply these schools damaged African identity, we must first understand what they were and why they existed. Colonial boarding schools in Africa were not isolated projects or humanitarian ventures. They were deliberate tools of cultural engineering, designed and executed by European colonial powers, often in partnership with Christian missionaries. The British, French, Belgians, Portuguese, and Germans all used these schools to systematically replace African traditions with European ideology. Education was not the goal, assimilation was. From the late 1800s through the mid-1900s, as European empires tightened their grip across the continent, boarding schools began to appear in colonies like Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana, Uganda, Tanzania, Senegal, Congo, and beyond. They were often located far from villages, requiring children to live on site, completely isolated from their families, language, and culture. Attendance was sometimes voluntary, promised with gifts or hope of progress, but in many cases children were taken without true consent. These schools were often administered by Christian missionaries who believed it was their divine duty to save African souls. But saving in their eyes meant erasing. Children were baptized, renamed, and forced to renounce their traditions. They were forbidden from speaking their native languages. English, French, or Portuguese was enforced instead. Traditional songs, rituals, and stories were replaced with hymns, catechisms, and Western history. The school curriculum was not designed to empower African children. It was designed to make them subservient colonial subjects. They were taught to obey, to serve, to accept European superiority. Critical thinking was discouraged. Memorization of foreign texts was emphasized. Many of these children were trained to become clerks, messengers, or servants, roles that served the colonial machinery. In French colonies, the assimilation policy went further, teaching select African children that their path to success was to become fully French. But no matter how fluent they became or how loyal they were rarely accepted as equals. In truth, colonial boarding schools were factories, mass-producing children who would fit into the empire's design, but who no longer fit within their own people. The loss was not just educational, it was spiritual, cultural, and generational. And this was only the beginning. Education or erasure? What happened inside? Behind the walls of these colonial boarding schools, the word education took on a very different meaning. To the outside world, these institutions appeared to be centers of learning. Classrooms, chalkboards, uniforms. But for the children inside, they were places of cultural erasure and psychological warfare. The moment a child crossed the threshold, they ceased to be who they were. Native names were replaced with Christian or European ones. In many cases, the names of their parents or ancestors were removed from all records. Some children were so young they would later forget their original names entirely, and with it, their lineage. The first rule was simple: no native language. Speaking in your mother tongue meant punishment. Some were whipped, others forced to kneel on sharp stones for hours. In French-run schools, speaking Wolof, Yoruba, or Igbo was seen as rebellion. In British schools, Kiswahili or Shona became grounds for humiliation. Children quickly learned to fear their own voice. Traditional clothing was banned, hair was cut, sacred beads, amulets, or items of ancestral significance were confiscated, sometimes burned. Prayer replaced ritual. History lessons skipped African kingdoms entirely and focused only on European heroes and colonial narratives. Children were taught to admire the very people who had colonized their homelands. Food was minimal. Sanitation was poor. Many schools were overcrowded. Diseases spread easily, and medical attention was often non-existent. In some institutions, older students were used to discipline younger ones, creating a cycle of abuse. Physical beatings were common, sometimes administered by missionaries, sometimes by local teachers, forced into the system. And beneath all of this ran a current of shame. Children were made to feel ashamed of where they came from, how they looked, what they believed, and even how they smelled. They were told their parents were ignorant, their tribes were backward, and their cultures were obstacles to progress. Many began to believe it. Sexual abuse, though rarely spoken of, existed in the shadows. Victims were silenced, complaints dismissed, and because many schools were remote and isolated, children had nowhere to run and no one to tell. The worst part? These schools didn't just destroy identity. They replaced it with nothing. Many children left unable to reconnect with their heritage, yet still unwelcome in colonial society. They existed in between worlds, in a space of deep confusion and internal conflict. This wasn't education. This was a calculated stripping of humanity. A system that didn't nurture children. It dismantled them piece by piece, and the consequences would ripple far beyond the classroom walls. While colonial boarding schools operated behind closed walls, far from villages and home fires, the pain did not stop at the school gates. It reached deep into the heart of every family, every community, and every elder who once believed that knowledge should strengthen, not sever. For most African families, education had always been a communal affair, one where wisdom was passed from grandparents to children, not from rulers to subjects. Knowledge was embedded in storytelling, in rituals, in the land itself. Every child was a vessel of ancestry, a living thread connecting the past to the future. When that child was taken away, it wasn't just a physical absence. It was as though a part of the community's spirit had been cut off. Some families willingly sent their children, lured by promises from missionaries or colonial officers. They were told their sons would become leaders, their daughters would find new opportunities. Others had no choice, pressured by force, taxes, or church authority. But all shared a similar heartbreak. Weeks turned into months, months into years. And in many cases, their children returned as strangers, if they returned at all. The boy who once danced at the harvest festival now bowed his head to foreign prayers. The girl who once sang in her mother tongue now winced when her name was pronounced the old way. Some children refused to eat traditional food. Others were ashamed to sit with their own families, having been taught their ways were uncivilized. Parents often stood in silence, unable to recognize the child they once cradled. They had dreamt of education as a bridge to the future. What they received was a wall. For those whose children died in the schools from illness, neglect, or abuse, there were often no explanations, no bodies, no graves to visit, just a silence deeper than grief, and a lingering guilt that perhaps they had handed over their child to something they didn't fully understand. And for the communities left behind, there was an even greater wound: the severing of cultural transmission. Elders could no longer pass on proverbs, rituals, or sacred songs. Languages began to fade. Dances once performed at coming-of-age ceremonies were forgotten. Entire traditions unraveled in a single generation, not because they lost meaning, but because there was no one left to remember them. This was the hidden cost of colonial education. It didn't just take children, it robbed entire communities of their future guardians of culture. The loss still lingers in villages today, in unspoken words, in empty ceremonies, in the quiet sorrow of grandparents who tried to whisper their stories to children who no longer understood. The doors of the colonial boarding schools may have closed decades ago, but their shadows still stretch across Africa. The scars are not always visible, not in ruins or monuments, but they live in the minds of generations, in the silence between parents and children, in the hesitation of a tongue trying to remember a forgotten word, in the quiet ache of identity torn and stitched back wrongly. For many former students, the trauma never left. Some have spoken, years later, about the nightmares that haunted them, the sound of the bell that meant punishment, the sting of the whip, the cold eyes of teachers who stripped them of their names. Others never spoke at all. They returned to their communities unable to reconnect, ashamed of what they had become and uncertain of who they were. Many passed that silence on to their own children, unwilling or unable to talk about what happened behind those walls. That silence became generational. And that is where the deepest damage lies. When a child forgets the stories of their ancestors, a culture begins to fade. When a language is lost, a worldview disappears. When a people begin to believe their way of life was wrong, simply because it was different, colonization is no longer on the outside. It has entered the mind. Across the continent, this legacy can still be felt. In the struggle of African nations to reclaim indigenous knowledge systems, in the way European languages dominate classrooms, courts, and politics, while local tongues are often dismissed as informal or inadequate. In the educational systems that still reflect colonial structures, rewarding Western thought while undermining traditional wisdom. And perhaps most painfully, in the internalized shame some Africans carry about their own heritage, their names, their skin, their spirituality, their ancestors. This is the cost of cultural dismemberment. Rebuilding has begun. Elders are sharing what they remember. Languages are being revived. Schools are being challenged to teach history honestly. But the damage took generations to inflict, and it will take generations to heal. Because colonial boarding schools didn't just disrupt education, they rewrote what it meant to be educated. And in doing so, they planted seeds of confusion, self-doubt, and erasure in the hearts of children who were supposed to carry the future. Erased from history. Why we never heard about it? For something so widespread and devastating, one might wonder, why isn't the story of Africa's colonial boarding schools known around the world? Why aren't they taught in classrooms, mentioned in textbooks, or remembered with memorials? The answer is both simple and painful, because history is written by those who benefit from forgetting. In the narrative of colonialism handed down by Western institutions, schools were painted as gifts. The colonizers were civilizing Africa, bringing literacy, religion, and progress. Boarding schools were portrayed as symbols of benevolence, not violence. And so, the cruelty within those walls was quietly swept away. Unlike in Canada or Australia, where residential school abuses have slowly entered public discourse due to years of pressure from Indigenous survivors, Africa's story remained buried. Many African countries gained independence while still trying to hold fragile nationhood together. And in doing so, many governments adopted the same colonial systems that had once harmed them, including the education model. There were no commissions of inquiry, no televised apologies, no national remembrance days for the children who never came home, or for the cultures that were shattered. The trauma was absorbed in silence, often dismissed as a necessary part of development. Even in African history syllabi today, colonial education is discussed in terms of infrastructure. Schools built, literacy rates increased. But rarely is the psychological cost acknowledged. Rarely is the brutality inside those institutions examined. And the world outside Africa? It barely knows this history exists, because it challenges the comforting myth of the colonizer as teacher, because it forces the West to reckon not just with violence, but with the deliberate design of erasure, the idea that intelligence had to wear a European face. And let's not forget, many of the missionaries and institutions that ran these schools still exist today, some rebranded, some quietly continuing their work under a different name. Their role in cultural destruction has never truly been held to account. This is why the story remains hidden, because to confront it means acknowledging that the project of colonization was not just about land or resources, it was about identity theft on a civilizational scale. But the silence cannot last forever, because across Africa voices are rising, stories are being remembered, languages are being revived, and the truth, no matter how deeply buried, is finding its way back into the light. Remembering, reclaiming, and healing. They called it education. But what they really did was teach children how to forget who they were. Forget their language, forget their gods, forget their songs, their roots, their pride, and learn to see themselves through the eyes of a stranger. Africa's colonial boarding schools didn't just remove children from their homes, they removed them from themselves. And when those children returned, if they did, they weren't the same. Some came back unable to speak to their own parents. Some didn't remember the names of their ancestors. Some carried a silent, burning shame they couldn't explain. And some never returned at all, buried in unmarked graves far from their villages, their stories swallowed in silence. This pain didn't end with them. Their children inherited it, and their children's children still feel it, in lost words, confused identities, broken customs, and the lingering echo of a question too many still ask: who am I supposed to be? But this story doesn't end in despair, because something powerful is happening. Across Africa, people are digging into the silence. They're reclaiming forgotten names, relearning lost languages, reviving ceremonies that were once forbidden, writing books, making films, sharing stories, not to shame, but to heal. And as this history returns to the light, so does dignity. Because acknowledging this past doesn't divide, it restores. It gives generations the missing piece of their story. It says, what happened to you was not your fault. You were not uncivilized. You were never inferior. You were interrupted, and you survived. To those who still live with the silence, your voice matters. To the world that has long ignored this truth, it's time to listen. Because justice begins not with vengeance, but with truth. And the truth is this: Africa didn't need to be saved. It needed to be left alone. If this story moved you, share it. Let the world know that Africa's children were not just victims, they were survivors of a system designed to erase them. Subscribe to History and Beyond for more stories like this. Stories that challenge the narrative, restore forgotten voices, and tell the truth that history books left behind.